best way because it takes away the gray area.
Yes.
Right.
If you hear a guy out of his mouth speaking language of love, like what Marie said, not judging people after the flesh, not judging people according to their works, speaking well of them, speaking well of God's thoughts for them, there's a great indication that they're filled with God.
Yes.
Because God is love. Right?
Yeah. It's a good yardstick.
Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
Does that help with? And I wasn't going to say anything about 1 John, but I went back and started reading it, and I thought, you know what? I'll just, because I don't think we covered that in the Bible study, the context there. We just kind of got into the rest of it there. But that combined with the animal sacrifices is a good thing.
Yeah, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If the author of Hebrews was here and he found the Christian church busy with 1 John 1:9, he would come in and say, you ought to be teachers by now. It's been so long. But you're in need of being taught again.
Yes.
For you're ignorant in the word of righteousness. Just like Hebrews 5 says. You can go back and read it. When the author of Hebrews comes and finds the Hebrews trying to cleanse themselves from sin, he comes and says, when it ought to be time for you to be teaching others, you're in need of being taught again. Right? You're a babe. You're in need of the milk again. You're not ready for strong meat. You're in need of being taught the word of righteousness. You're unskilled in the word of righteousness. What's the word of righteousness? That believing on the Son makes you righteous.
Yeah.
And so if you are righteous, then there's no cleansing. There's no confession to cleanse yourself.
Sure.
God cleansed you.
You go back to the definition of righteous, right? You are as you ought to be.
That's right.
So if I am as I ought to be, I don't need to confess anything.
That's right.
Boom.
Right? And so the apostles would have a field day with this. And another good thing to think about this, and people don't, this is just an intellectual thing. But I'm pretty sure I've said this before. But, you know, we all have our devices with all the different, I got like, I don't know, 200 Bibles on here that I can just flip in between and pull all kinds of different languages, all kinds of stuff. We all have our paper Bibles even before that.
Oh, sure.
Everybody's got a freaking Bible, right? Well, back then they didn't have no Bibles, right? They had scrolls, and those scrolls did not contain the New Testament.
That's right.
Okay? And so none of them had their hands on even the Old Testament scriptures. Like in the synagogues, they might have a copy if they were lucky, and they could maybe read it sometimes, and they could commit it to memory through oral tradition. But none of them had the New Testament letters. Okay? So it's not like the church in Ephesus sat with John's letter. The church in Rome didn't sit with John's letter.
Right.
The church in Galatia didn't sit with John's letter. None of those churches, the Corinthian church, didn't have John's letter. So the only letter that says this confession of sin thing is John's one letter, and only one group of people had that letter. No one else had that letter.
Wow.
Now, do you find that language about confession of sin in Paul's letter to the Romans?
No.
In Paul's letter to the Corinthians?
No.
In Paul's letter to the Galatians? In Paul's letter to the Ephesians? In the letter of Hebrews, do you find that? So, in Peter's letters. Okay, so I guess all those apostles didn't understand the importance of this doctrine, and all their churches that they planted are just screwed because they didn't teach them that they needed to be confessing their sin every day. Do you see what I'm saying there?
Quite clearly.
And so if we were interpreting this doctrine correctly, then you would find it taught in all of the other letters. The same way. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I guarantee you, Paul, the great apostle, didn't leave out something that was so critical to the church in Rome.
Right.
Or to the churches in Corinthians. He would have most certainly come with that. And he did not come with the way we teach that.
Yeah.
Why not?
Because it wasn't for us.
Because it wasn't written the way we interpret it.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Now listen, in Paul's letter, he does talk about not trusting in your works for life, and he talks about believing in the grace of God. Mm-hmm. He does talk about believing in Jesus and not believing in the law. Mm-hmm. He does talk about walking in darkness and walking in the light. Right? He does talk about all those things, but what he doesn't talk about is how you got to confess your sin every day. Do you see?
Yes.
And so that's a great indication that we're interpreting that wrong.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I guarantee you, Paul would have said something. He would have been on it. Peter would have been on it. They would have all been on it. James would have been on it.
Yes.
Right? None of them were on it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that's one of the things that'll make you think, okay, then what is John really saying?
Yes.
And then you go back and you read, if you're like me, you read it several hundred times. And you find the Spirit starting to put it together like a puzzle piece, right? And next thing you know, you're like, oh. Like I preached 1 John chapter 1 a million times. And even as Cindy said, well, can you just explain it? I thought, it's not fresh in my mind. I can't. Well, then I'll go back and read it. And all of a sudden it starts
Boom. Yeah,
coming
right
together,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
Yes.
About
Yeah, that's
just
very
just
good.
intellectual Bible interpretation?
Yeah. No,
right?
That's very good.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can do that with other doctrines too. I guarantee you, all of the apostles were talking about similar truths. The same truth,
Sure.
maybe in a different light, depending on the people they were talking to and what was coming against them. But you're going to find the same truth in all of the letters. It isn't that one letter has some truths that the other letters don't. Do you see what I'm saying? Because otherwise, those people would be SOL.
Okay, right.
Right.
Does that make sense?